in this first talk for this retreat and for the next few talks, I want to work through a progression. I want to begin by stepping back and reflecting on what the core goal or aim is, at least from the traditional point of view, this enlightenment, this liberation that we're talking about. What is it? What is the aim? And then to look in depth at the foundational building blocks of any meditation practice with all the different styles. They're really all built on foundation of mindfulness, concentration, insight, along with the heart qualities that we've been talking about. And I'm going to, so of course the heart qualities and the mindfulness are important and they will come in, but I'm going to spend time really focusing in on, we may not get to it today, but certainly by tomorrow, getting into this word samadhi that we translate as concentration, the ability of the mind to become steady and settled. It's a big, big topic. So I want to really it's a controversial topic. It's understood and taught in many ways. So really look in quite a bit of detail and depth at the range of ways that it's taught and understood. And then so we can make informed choices. So hopefully it's not confusing, but we can get clear in our minds about how we want to relate to it in our own practices. Do the same thing with the topic on insight, because it's not just one way. And then come back and bring it all together in a range of ways that concentration and insight are taught and experienced to work together, to be separate practices, work together, integrated into one practice. And so hopefully it comes together. And the idea being then that we can each, there's not a right or wrong, but we each want to find our own relationship with it all. But it's nice if we can be informed. Sometimes we don't know and we just hear what we've read in a book or some teacher has told us, and that's totally fine. I think that's what happens for many of us. But the more we can learn, then it helps us make our own informed decisions. So that's the idea for the next today and probably at least a couple of more days for this retreat of talks. So to begin with this idea of the aim or goal, I need to first say, I hope you know that it's not for anyone else to tell you or to tell any of us what our goal should be. So I'm going to talk a little from the traditional point of view, but I'll bet you if we won't take time to do it, but if we were to go around and ask everyone here in the retreat, I'll bet you we would not all have the same aims or goals with our Dharma practice. Some of us may not even have articulated that clearly what our aims or goals are. We may have a general sense, or we may be more specific. So while it's not for anyone else to tell us what our life should be about or what our aims or goals should be in the Dharma, I hope, and my wish for all of us is that we can at least let Dharma teachings inform us, influence us as we make whatever choices or aims or goals then that we come to on our own. I'm going to be speaking from the way the tradition I've practiced in mostly has come out of Theravada Buddhism. And I don't want to get into a whole thing on the history and development of Buddhism, but I am going to be speaking from really the teachings that have been preserved in the language Pali, and in particular the set of teachings called the Pali Suttas. You may have heard the word sutras, that's the Sanskrit, sutta is the Pali. And these are the discourses, the teachings that have preserved really preserve the teachings for, it was an oral tradition for hundreds of years from the time of the Buddha, but probably within, I don't know, we don't know, but maybe within 500 years after the Buddha or something like that, it was written down. So preserved for 2,500 years and actually written for maybe the 2,000 of those 2,500 years and carried as a living tradition today. And, we get informed by many other traditions, but just want to be clear that that's going to be the way I'm going to be articulating it. And even within that, there's a range of understandings. It's not just one way. So, you may bring in understandings from other traditions too, and that's fine, because we each want to find what brings the practice and our spiritual lives really alive for each of us. So a couple of ways I want to just talk about, a few ways that that the Buddha is recorded as speaking about this goal. So we hear these words: enlightenment, freedom, liberation, awakening. There's a lot of words that get used. One of the ways that there's two or three main ways in the old texts that the Buddha is recorded as expressing this ultimate goal. One of the ways is in terms of the Four Noble Truths. And so there'll be many places where it's recorded the Buddha goes through a whole progression in his own practice, his own spiritual development. And then when he finally reaches his enlightenment, it's expressed as coming to know the Four Noble Truths as it really is. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. The Four Noble Truths are just, I think most of you know it, but I'll just say, there's this word dukkha that we translate as suffering, and I'll just leave it at that for now. It actually has a much wider connotation than just suffering, but I think for the sake of our conversation now, it's close enough. And so it'll get the job done. So, the Four Noble Truths are: the first truth is the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering. The second is the cause of suffering. The third is the ending of dukkha. And the fourth is the way leading to the ending. And that formulation actually appears in the texts in two main ways. In one of the ways it's often given is there's a whole little paragraph for each. It's more of a intellectual understanding and an explanation of the teaching. So the first one, the teaching on suffering or dukkha, it doesn't just say there's a truth of dukkha. It goes in and it gives this whole list of all the different burdens of life. And it'll say, having possessions is suffering, and having duties and responsibilities, I'm paraphrasing, and families and all this stuff of life is suffering, right? And it says birth, aging, illness, death are all suffering. It lays this all out. And similarly for all of the Four Noble Truths, there's a whole explanatory phrase or paragraph that's written. And even the fourth noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path, this path of practice. I won't go into the Eightfold Path that much on this retreat. We can if people want, but if I'm not asked for it, I'm not planning to get into that so much. There's a whole long explanation on the Eightfold Path. It's several pages. It's quite long. So that's one way it shows up in the old texts. I'm a little rusty on the suttas, but if I recall correctly, every place that the expression of the Four Noble Truths is put into the mouth of the Buddha, it's not this long paragraphs and explanation. It's terse, and he simply says, he realizes it is, this is suffering, this was the cause, this was the ending, and here's how I got to the end of suffering. That's it. And I find that that's very, very powerful, because it's not an intellectual understanding then. It shifts completely, and it's something very immediate and direct and experiential. That was the liberation. One of the ways it's expressed in the Buddha. He's really seeing moment to moment, in the moment, what's actually going on in his experience. And he's experiencing, he knows profoundly, deeply. He gets it on a whole nother level than the ordinary human experience of his suffering. What its cause is right there. How he let go right there. That was its ending. It wasn't a concept. It was actually the lived reality of it, and the way how it came. So that's one. It doesn't give us a lot of detail, but it actually, if we unpack that, it contains a lot. So that's one way that the liberation of the Buddha is expressed. And again, you can look up certain suttas. I'm happy to give you some links if you let me know where you can find those suttas, where he actually talks about his own path and progression and all the steps he went through that culminated in this understanding the Four Noble Truths as it is. There is another formulation that's connected, but it's different. And it's the enlightenment of the liberation is through what's called the destruction of these certain forces or tendencies that create suffering that are called, the Pali is asavas, asavas, asavas. And it's translated in a lot of ways, but one of the ways I think works well is called the taints. Well, what's a taint? It's something that kind of, well, it taints something, it defiles something. So there are qualities in the mind that keep us from this liberation. And so it's not expressed as something positive that you gain, but it's a destruction of these forces. And I'll just name what they are and maybe say a little bit about it. It's a whole big topic. But one of the taints is ignorance. So there's a whole thing. Well, what do we mean by ignorance? Let me come back to that in a minute. Ignorance is one. Sensual desire is one. Ignorant sensual desire, something called becoming or being. So that's like, well, what does that mean? And those are the three, and sometimes a fourth is added to the list, which is views. So each of those are pretty big topics. But a simple way to think about them is they're forces in our minds that keep us caught up in things, if you will, or this is my own word, entangled. So what I mean by that is, well, ignorance, it's not, what does it mean? What is ignorance? I think from a Dharma perspective, you can think of it as, sometimes it's described as not fully going back to the Four Noble Truths, thinking that which leads to suffering is in fact, what we think is going to lead us to happiness. But in fact, it's what leads to suffering. I'll come back to that in a few moments. I have another nice quote here I think captures that nicely. What is this about being or becoming? A simple way to think about it is that having to be something, we create identities, gaining, accumulating, all this, we're in the game and we're playing it a certain way. And in a way, well, let me read a quote from you that I think captures it very nicely. This is more modern language. So I started my meditation practice in 1970. And when I began, I was more in a Hindu-oriented yoga tradition. I came into the Buddhist world kind of in the mid-70s. So this was my first teacher. His name was Hari Das. He died not that many years ago. If you know, in Santa Cruz here in California, there's a center called the Mount Madonna Center. And so that was the center around him. And he taught a path called Ashtanga Yoga, 8-limbed yoga. So even though he wasn't using Buddhist language, I think this captures something about this idea of how we create suffering and what liberation might look like. So he says here, we live our entire existence from this point of view. We seek those things, situations, and people that make us happy and avoid those things that make us unhappy. But even when conditions seem ideal to us, there is always that nagging certainty somewhere in our minds that the situation will eventually change, that the security and happiness of the moment will ultimately be lost. In truth, we are never totally at peace. There is always something to be anxious about. Ordinary life is really a constant dilemma. So I want to pause it. There's another piece here I'm going to add, but let me just go back on this and just see if it rings true for you. He says, we live our entire existence from this point of view, seeking those things, situations, and people that make us happy, and avoiding those things that make us unhappy. So let's pause with that. I think he's pointing to something that the Dharma points out a lot about what we call the human condition, right? And that I often try to, I kind of get a laugh, but it's not really funny. But, I say, is anyone here trying to have more things happen to you or more of the experiences that you don't want? Are you trying to have more unpleasant? And anyone here trying to have less of what you want, less pleasant things happen in your life? Of course not. All of us as human beings, I think it's deeply wired into what it is to be a living being, right? You seek happiness and ease and well-being, less stress, less suffering, less pain. And we want to go towards the good and get away from the difficulties, right? This is foundational Dharma. And the problem is that first of all, I don't think we're doing anything wrong. This is what living beings do. It's not criticizing us in the Dharma. When you go to the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering that comes from clinging. So there's this whole thing about clinging. It means when we're holding on, we're constricted around things. We can't let things be. We're in a kind of an adversarial relationship with ourselves and our own experience, instead of letting go and letting things be more. And the second noble truth is, well, what causes us to cling? It's craving. Some people say that Buddhism says desire is bad, but that's not accurate. There's lots and lots of talk about wholesome desire in the old texts. If you didn't desire to practice, you wouldn't do it, for example. It's a particular kind of desire. The word in Pali is tanha, which is translated as thirst. That gives you an idea of the kind of desire it's talking about. It's gotta have, right? It's gotta have. I'll give you an example. My son likes to, is a mountain biker. He likes, I've been getting into it a little bit. I'm not great, but I'm getting some skills. So I've got a mountain bike. And so I'll go out, and it's just something I can do, like a father-son thing, which I get to be with my son and do it. But also it's kind of fun. I get exercise, I'm in nature, and it just feels great. I really like it. And as you get some skill, if any of you know this, you start going down more bumps and more hills, and it's kind of fun. So I like it. I'm drawn to do it. There's no question about it. There's a pleasure to all of the ways I just talked about that draws me into it. So that's a kind of desire. But it's a good example because I'm not that into it. And if something happened, I hurt my knee or my bike broke or something, and I couldn't mountain bike anymore, that's be okay with me. It hasn't it's a desire and it's pleasant, but I can just let it go. It's not a big deal. It hasn't driven me into a clinging. But it's all the things that drive us in life that we can't let go around, where we don't have a freedom or a liberation in, where we're enslaved to our desires in a sense. That's getting more to what we're talking about here. So I think even, I kind of imagine that even if you took, I don't know, a protozoa or certain bacteria, and you shine a light, if they don't like light, they'd kind of try to squiggle out of the light, or if they want light, they'd kind of come in, or to the nutrients, they'd go towards it. Even the most simple life, I imagine that's just part of the life force. So we don't have to stop being a human being, but we'd like to find a way to be a human being, live, but not be driven around by our likes and dislikes. So I'll come back to Haridas in a minute, but let me just read you one more here that I think sort of captures that. Just one moment, please. I should have found this quote ahead of time, but I didn't. Just please bear with me for a few moments. Oops. Sorry. I appreciate your patience. So this is a quote from the second great patriarch of second great Taoist master, Zhuang Tzu. I cannot tell if what the world considers happiness is happiness or not. All I know is that when I consider the way they go about attaining it, I see them carried away headlong, grim and obsessed, caught in the general onrush of the human herd, unable to stop themselves or to change their direction. All the while they claim to be just on the point of attaining happiness. So this is the kind of entanglement in things that's being pointed to. So when Hari Das says we seek, our entire existence is seeking those things that make us happy and avoiding those that make us unhappy. And he goes on, I'll repeat, but even when conditions seem ideal to us, there's always the certainty somewhere in our minds that the situation will change, that the security and happiness of the moment will ultimately be lost. In truth, we are never totally at peace. There is always something to be anxious about. Ordinary life is really a constant dilemma. So it's really for each of us to just reflect. It's not, is this true? Does it ring true or not? Right? I certainly can relate to this. I hope it's not the entire picture, but I think there's a lot of truth in that for me. And I think many people could relate to some truth in there. So then he ends by saying, spiritual practice, or the path of Dharma, he used a different term here, has nothing to do with stoicism or self-denial or disregard for worldly responsibility. Real spirituality means learning how to live life as free, conscious, and loving beings instead of from the point of view of dilemma. So that's an articulation that I think for me kind of is another way to think about this idea of a liberation through non-clinging. I'm just trying to hit it from a few different perspectives. So this goes back to freeing ourselves from that list called asavas. When we talk about sensual desire, I don't know if the pull of pleasure and pain ever drops away completely for anyone. Even the Buddha, after his enlightenment, there's stories about him. He had a bad back, and there's a story where I'm paraphrasing in modern vernacular, but he says, my back's killing me, Nanda, you got to go give the Dharma talk. I have to go lie down, So, he was a human being too. So I don't know that process stops, but I think what can happen is we can, when I use this word, disentangle from it, we see, this is the wisdom, the ending of the ignorance. We see things as they are, that unpleasant, come and go. These experiences are just rising and passing away due to their own causes and conditions. And despite our best efforts, and I don't know if any of us are going to or should stop trying to arrange life the way we want it to be, right? We want to take care of ourselves and, be healthy and hopefully eat well and do all the, have a life, and that's fine. But we're being asked to add in a piece. That's really one way to think about it. We're being asked to add in the piece that says, I think maybe it's like this, that despite our best efforts and intentions, I'm sure you may have noticed, sometimes you'll get what you want in life. Sometimes you won't get what you want in life, and sometimes you're going to get what you don't want. So we do our best around that. And this sounds kind of nonsensically simplistic, but think about, just take some time if you've never done it, and just to notice your own mind. And here's an experiment for you if you've never done this. Just take 1 minute, a few minutes, an hour, part of a day, a whole day, a week. Pay attention to what percentage of your thoughts or your mental activity are you just totally at peace? And what percentage are your thoughts some version of, am I okay? Am I going to be okay? How am I going to be okay? What am I going to do about this? Planning for that, worrying about this. Just notice what percentage of the time you're at peace, and kind of goes back to Hari Das. He says, in fact, we're never totally at peace. Well, we have to look and do the experiment ourselves. But I think when I've invited people to do this experiment, most people report back that at least a fair percentage of time is, they would say they're not really at peace. It's something's not quite right. It's worried, whatever. And so the liberation is asking us then to add in the peace that rather than just trying to get what we want and avoid what we don't want, we start to make a shift. And our well-being and happiness can be more connected with not what is the experience, but how am I relating with whatever it is that's happening, right? I'm not saying that the actual experience will have no impact on you at all. That's probably a high bar, but certainly we can start to make some shifts and it can get better. This is, we're on this path heading to more and more freedom because we can start to choose how we're relating to what's happening. Can we meet our experience with more of a sense of allowing and letting be? Now, I have to say, this doesn't mean that we stop caring about ourselves or others or the world and all the important things in life, within ourselves, local community, the greater community, the world. All of those things matter, they're important, and we'll find for ourselves how much we're drawn to be engaged with those things, hopefully make differences in the world. We don't have to stop doing any of that. But another way to think about it is, rather than meeting life out of a reactivity, we can replace reactivity with a wise response. You get the difference? Doesn't that feel differently? Reactivity versus a response, a wise response to life. It starts to shift everything, because we're not just driven. If we're just driven out of the reactivity unconsciously, as you know, we've all been there many, many times, we don't have any freedom or choice. Our well-being is completely at the effect of circumstance. And that's a pretty tenuous well-being. But when we start to take ownership within ourselves for our own, we don't give our happiness, or I like the word well-being. You'll hear me use that word a lot. I tend to use it more than happiness, just kind of personal liking to that phrase, well-being. We don't have to give it over. We can own it more. The problem is, and this is where the practices come in, all this meditation is, if someone says, you know, if you hear these kind of teachings and you say, yeah, that's for me, that's what I'm going to do, I'm signing up for that. I want to shift my well-being so it's not caught up in circumstances. It's more how I'm relating, and I'm going to learn to love and let be and all of that. What you will find is you will have moments of that, sure, but it won't take long for the right causes and conditions to come together, and you'll be caught right back again. And you won't even know it until sometime later you wake up out of the trance again. And oh, what happened? I thought I was going to be liberated, and I just got reactive, because we have so many deeply ingrained, conditioned, habitual mental patterns, right? We've been spending a lifetime, or if you believe the traditional teachings, lifetimes. You don't have to believe in all of that, but you know, a lot has gone into strengthening these conditioned patterns. And there's a whole teaching around conditionality. And it's so simple, it sounds kind of nonsensical, but it basically says that all things happen due to causes and conditions. And anybody would hear that and say, well, I mean, things aren't happening for no reason. We may not always know the reason, but there's a reason why things happen. But right in there lies the path to freedom. If we can get the key to start bringing some awareness. This is the insight, the mindfulness, the self-awareness, the stripping away of asava, of ignorance, and seeing what's really going on. We start to gain access to these unwholesome patterns. But I don't like to say good or bad, because it's not a value judgment, but I just mean unwholesome, that don't serve us well, that lead to more suffering. And we can start to, I use this term, you'll hear me use a lot, disentangle from those, or they can release, and different conditioning can come up that's more wholesome, so that we, example is just what I was saying, it can be a shift from reactivity to responsiveness, wise response, in which there's some, at least the choice of some freedom and chance of some freedom and choice. So that is kind of the idea. So we were talking about the model of the Four Noble Truths, just going back to kind of finish up on this model of the asavas. I've kind of touched on a lot. Ignorance, sensual desire. Again, we're going to have, if you've got a body and your senses are functioning, if your ears aren't working, you can't hear, that's different. But for whatever of our senses are functioning, we're going to have contact with experience, and then we're not going to get away from pleasant or unpleasant. But what it's meaning by this liberation of the taint of sensual desire is being driven by it, right? When you're sitting in meditation, one of the things we can play with sometimes is, it's one of these things of, when discomfort arises, when do we move our bodies and shift, and when do we stay with it? And, it's a balance there. We have to kind of find the balance. There are some times when we hang in there with something, and really it probably would have served us better out of kindness to like stretch your knee out or shift your back. And it really is a helpful thing to move. And sometimes we'll sit too long, and okay, we ended up suffering longer than we needed to. It can happen. Conversely, there are times when we want to move and shift. We may think it's out of caring for ourselves. We could have hung out there a little bit and just gotten to know how am I when I'm being with pain or difficulty and suffering, and start to learn. It's like a training. Can you start to learn to, in the midst of it, find some of that letting go and letting be? That could be part of a training. So we have these opportunities, even in something simple like our sitting meditation, different ways we might choose to work. And as an aside, this is part of the learning, right? Is coming to know more and more when's the time to go in one direction or the other, to stay with it or to move and relieve it. And life is like that too, right? When is it time to make a shift, try to change things? When is it time to just, you have to be with it and work with it? And we need both skills. You don't have to get it right. You just make your best choices. This is for all of practice. And then you look to see what happens, and we learn, right? And even if we, later on, as we reflect back, we realize a different course of action would have served us better, then we take it as a learning experience. We don't have to beat ourselves up or judge ourselves. And, this word judging doesn't have to all, I use the word discernment when I mean in a wholesome sense. And I use this just my own way, judging, when I mean it in sort of the unhelpful, suffering generating sense. So we can start to, we learn in that way. So that's what we mean by the sensual desire. It's not being at the mercy of it. It's not that you don't experience. The ignorance, this thing about becoming, it's actually tied, that asava, a taint, is sort of similar. It's having to be something, an identity that we cling to. We all, I guess, have identities, but I don't know how many of you know this, but there's been this whole, most of you may, well, you're on retreat, you may not know, but there's this whole thing of, in England, well, he's living in America now, Prince Harry and his wife Meghan did this whole big interview with Oprah Winfrey. It was on TV last night, and I think it's playing tonight in England. And it's this whole big giant blow up about how they were treated by the royal family in England. And people are taking sides, and it's this whole big thing. And I wasn't paying that much attention, but I actually just watched a little bit of it. I was just curious. And one of the things, I don't really know what Prince Harry's wife, Meghan, is really like, but the way she presented, which I thought was really nice, they were talking about, being a royal and stepping away and losing that. And she was just talking about how she really didn't feel I don't remember her words, but she wasn't feeling a clinging or having to have that identity. It was perfectly fine to let that identity go. And I think she said something like, because I know who I am. And so that's another way. It's not traditional Buddhist language, but it's coming to self-knowledge, knowing who we are, and then not having to create something else that we have to be okay, right? So that's this idea of becoming, having to be, this stepping into creating all this world around us. So that's kind of the idea on the asavas. So the question is, what would life look like if we lived in a way that was freer from the forces at work articulated by the Four Noble Truths? This craving, this thirst, basically means getting away from unpleasant and trying to keep moving towards the pleasant and being driven by that is really what it's talking about. If that loosened up, so we weren't so driven to fall into the clinging, what might our experience be like? We've all had moments of that, by the way. We may not notice a lot of those moments. We've all had moments where we were, there wasn't a lot of craving and clinging, and we were kind of at peace, and we may not even notice them. Sometimes we might. It doesn't mean we go into some ecstatic bliss necessarily. But as we live in those more and more, what I have found, especially through the meditation practice, is the deeper stages in the meditation get subtler, but more satisfying. So it may not be so dramatic. I remember in my early days of practice, this many, many years ago, I was on some retreat, and I started opening into some new territory in my meditative states. And I was pretty excited about it. I went and ran to the teacher and like, this is happening, that. And it was good stuff that was happening. And the teacher, he just said, well, that's great, but I wouldn't get too excited about it. Both the pleasant and unpleasant just keep getting more stronger anyway. Don't make a big deal about it. And I don't think he was trying to be dismissive. It felt a little dismissive at the time, but I think he was just trying to, but he was right. He's exactly right. Not only in life, but certainly in meditation. We'll talk more about this in samadhi. I think get more into it tomorrow. It can be, some of you know this from your own experience, it can be very pleasant, profoundly, really great. And it can feel that way, and that's great. We can appreciate those, and actually there's a lot of power that comes from the good feelings of that. It has a place in practice. But we start to also open up to deeper levels in our own being. Some of you have heard this story I've told when my wife came back she was sitting a 2 or 3 month retreat, and I hadn't spoken to her much. Sometimes if one of us would go on a retreat, sometimes that would happen, one of us would go with the other. Sometimes we'd check in once or twice a week just to stay connected. It didn't mess up our retreats or anything. Just, hey, how you doing? I'm okay, great, glad to hear it. Have a good retreat. But we'd hardly communicated. I don't remember why. And she came back and she was complaining, and she wasn't actually laughing, but it was funny looking back. She said, like she's had a hard retreat. It's like, I don't know if this meditation's so great. There was a lot of stuff in there that I didn't want to know was in there. Do I have to feel everything? Do I have to see everything? And then she made a joke and said, maybe it's better that you go through life. She obviously, it was a joke, she said, and you don't feel anything, nothing. And then the way she said it, you have to excuse my language because she cursed a little bit. She said, you go through life, you don't have to feel all this. And maybe, I don't know, just before you die, you get one moment of, oh shit, and then you're dead. Maybe that's better then all this suffering and work and coming to know ourselves and everything. And okay, she'd had a hard retreat, but I can understand that. But really, these forces that are in us, it's like, they use the image of the iceberg, right? Where only the little bits above the surface and so much is below the surface. And of course, if we don't see these forces, or we're not aware of these forces, it doesn't mean they're not working on us, right? And so if we start this path of practice, both, the ups and downs come more and more, but right along with it, yes, we'll have times like my wife where we get buffeted around by it, but the trick is to come to the places of equanimity, where we hold it all of our being, and we can allow ourselves to be, and that holds it all, including the challenging places. And I remember a place for myself I was on a very long retreat, it was a year-long retreat, and I don't know, I was months and months into this thing. So you get pretty deep in, and one day I remember where I used to go into the dining hall when no one would be there. I'd get lonely in my room. Somehow, if I went in the dining hall, I didn't feel lonely. And I would do my walking meditation in there. And I remember walking, and all these difficulties. I was just having one of these days, and it can happen even on retreats, right? You can be in these just amazing meditative states, but also go through the ups and downs and have difficulties. And all the storm clouds of my mind were just raging. And it struck me, I realized that I was just as interested in my suffering as I was in my bliss, and could hold it all. I'm not making any grand claims. It's not that I never got caught again or never suffered, but in that time, and I started to open into it, let's just say some degree more, we don't have to reach the end of the path to start to get real benefits. We can start to get relief, as many of you know, along the path. So we start to hold it all more. And this is the place of equanimity. That equanimity doesn't mean my experience itself is so smoothed out that there's no bumps. It means all the full, if any of you know the John Kabat-Zinn, he has a couple of books, and I've always lusted after his book titles because they're great book titles, but he grabbed them, so it's too late. One's called Full Catastrophe Living. It doesn't have to be full catastrophe, but it just means opening up to all of our being and allowing and connecting and letting ourselves be. But how do we hold it with wisdom and with equanimity? That's the liberation. And he has another one called Wherever You Go, There You Are. So, and having heard the titles, I just saved you the cost of buying his books, because I think you get it and you don't need to read the book. It's pretty. Now, the trick is to really internalize it and really live it, but we get what he's pointing to, right? So this place of equanimity is starting to point to this liberation through non-clinging. Then I know I've been going on and on, but I'm just trying to paint these various ways to think about, so we can each think for ourselves what our own goals are. But one way I like to sum it all up is, if I had to take one word, I would use equanimity. Many of the ways that the path of practice and teachings are formulated, these different lists of qualities, end with the quality and culminate in equanimity. These deeper stages of samadhi that we'll get into in coming days, called jhana. When you get into something called the fourth jhana, which is pretty far along, the description of it in the classic texts gives a lot of emphasis to equanimity in the third and fourth jhana. So it's coming to even these meditative states. There's a list called the 7 factors of enlightenment. And we might touch on that a little here, but it's a very, very important list. Culminates in equanimity. These Brahma Viharas, qualities of the heart. First one, I'll just say them in some of the English translation without the Pali: loving kindness. Number 2, compassion. Number 3, called empathetic joy, sympathetic joy, altruistic joy, happiness at the happiness of another. And the 4th, equanimity. Brahma Viharas end in equanimity. There's some other lists I could say too. So a lot of these are really aiming towards, that's one way to articulate it if we understand it correctly. So going back to the kind of the image I gave from being on a retreat and having the storm clouds of the mind come through, and I said I was just as interested in the difficulties as I was in the bliss. That is an equanimity. But along with this, and this is another important part that can happen, these meditative states have a process called purification of mind. It doesn't get talked a lot about a lot, but I will get into it some, where it's not only the equanimity to hold all the ups and downs, but we get marinated in the samadhi, or it kind of ripens us in a way. And this disentangling process can happen, even sometimes, a lot of times when we're not consciously aware of the patterns, but they can disentangle, and we can end up freer in that way also. So it's not only more equanimous as the difficult ups and downs come, but the ups and downs do tend to smooth out too. So there's two aspects to becoming more balanced and freer in how we meet ourselves in life. So that's the way I would tend to kind of different ways to think about maybe what this path of liberation through non-clinging might perhaps mean. And then I hope, if that's useful, perhaps as you reflect for yourself, what the path might look like. And so then we just have a few minutes left for the talk now. We can reflect, okay, let's just say that sounds good. And as I said earlier, we might sign up for it. Hey, I'm up for that. But we all realize that why do we need to do these practices then? Because we do have these conditioned patterns, and we do need to disentangle them or smooth them out. And so that's where these practices come in. And so we're going to be talking then about what I consider, this is my own formulation, what I'm going to call the building blocks of the practice, at least as I'm presenting it. And the building blocks are mindfulness, concentration, and insight. And then I add in the heart qualities, because I think that is important. And I like to teach it in a way that suffuses through everything we're doing, not necessarily so much as separate practices, even though we're dedicating a slot on this retreat to do dedicated practice. And that's fine. You have to see how you relate to it. But I'm mostly going to be focusing from a meditation point of view on the mindfulness, concentration, and insight parts. And hopefully you're already getting that the spirit of love just comes into the way we want to hold ourselves with kindness and non-judgmentalness. And so then we want to understand again, why, what do we mean by this word samadhi? I'll explain more tomorrow. That we translate as concentration. What do we really mean by it? And then we can come to see how it is directly in service of this liberation that we're talking about, this equanimity. Same thing for insight. What's the range of ways that it's understood? And how does it is in the traditional teachings and in actual real life practice, does it contribute to this liberation? How does the mindfulness fit in? And then finally, how do these come together with each other? If you, because mindfulness is often, concentration and insight are often taught as distinct. Don't worry if you don't know about this, in a couple of days, you'll get all this. Distinct paths of practice and styles of practice. And you'll hear teachers say, oh, don't do concentration because you're not doing insight. And well, what do they mean? Why are they saying that? And is that true? I say it's not true, but we'll explore the range ourselves. And then you'll come, just because I say it isn't important, you'll come to your own assessment on what works best for you. So it's fine to separate them out as different styles of practice, but that's not the only way. And in fact, for me, it's always been a synthesized, they come together. So we want to talk about all that, lay all that out. And I think we can do it in a couple more talks. That seems ambitious, but but I think we can get there. So I just want to end by offering that actually mindfulness, concentration, and insight always have to work together. You actually cannot separate them out, even if you try. Let's just say you're doing a kind of practice called insight meditation. Lots and lots of ways it's taught and practiced, not just one way. We'll get to that. But for now, just whatever we mean by it. And you're not thinking about concentration at all. Well, you have to bring the mindfulness in right there. So the mindfulness comes in to be aware of, know what's happening. And just by paying attention, say, to changing experience or whatever you're practicing, you're having to bring your attention back. It's like coming back to the breath. You actually will cultivate some amount of steadiness and concentration. It will have to come in. So even if you're not aware of it, the concentration just has to come in there too. And also, let's just say you were doing a practice that you called concentration meditation. In many, many different forms. The mindfulness, you have to, you say you're working with your breath. We call that mindfulness of breathing meditation. The mindfulness is right in there. And the insight part, the wisdom part, has to come in because of working with challenges, working with difficulties, all the ups and downs that'll come on this path of concentration. So the insight learnings have to come in there. It just will. So in fact, you can't separate them out, but you can put different emphasis on them if you want to. So this is the kind of thing we want to tease apart. It is a big world, but it's actually can be simplified into a few main ways to talk about it. So that's what I want to pick up on. And I think what we'll do tomorrow at the talk is start in on the samadhi, the concentration side. And that whole talk will be just emphasized on that. And then we'll move on from that. So for now, I didn't mean to mention at the beginning, typically on this is totally shifting gears now. We only have 5 minutes and I hope it won't feel too abrupt. It's a little different. I meant to mention earlier, typically on the first day, so I think a lot of you are experienced meditators, so you probably know this, but if any of you who are very new to retreats, whenever you set aside, as much as you can, our normal activities, and you really go into the silence and you mostly are spending your day just sitting, and walking, it's very common, not for everyone, but that the first day and maybe the first couple of days can be especially challenging. I mentioned this at the opening yesterday. Difficulties can come anytime, but the first day or two can be particularly challenging. And because of that, for many retreats, it's standard to give the talk, this Dharma talk on the first day. They call it the hindrance talk. And if you go to, I've taught a lot of retreats, say, for example, at Spirit Rock, and you're back with the teachers figuring out, somebody says, okay, who's going to give the hindrance talk? Who's going to give and it's just scheduled out because they know so many people are suffering and need that. I reflected on this, but I purposely didn't want to give a hindrance talk. I wanted to sort of focus on what I've been bringing in today. But I simply just want to take a minute or two and mention that I have a rule of thumb in meditation that on retreat, or this could be in life too, at any given time, roughly a third of the people are in heaven, a third are in hell, and roughly a third are somewhere in between. And everybody's moving in and out of those categories all the time. And I do think there's some truth to that. So you will have your own experience. That's not for everybody. You might be having an easeful day, or you may be having a lot of difficulty and suffering. But just to offer that it goes with the territory, and especially knowing if a lot of challenges are coming up and it can be extra hard because you haven't had the concentration build on the retreat yet to help support you to meet the difficulties. It can be, we can get especially buffeted around by it. So if you're finding that happens, One is, it's an invitation. If you need support, as I've said before, you're welcome to reach out, and I'll be happy to talk with you, and all these things can be worked with. And if you don't choose to do that, but just to know that we want to bring all the things we've been talking about, as much self-kindness, knowing that, you know, all these experiences are coming and going, and try to work as skillfully as we can, and not add extra layers of suffering that's not needed, if we have the wisdom to, by getting in a battle with ourselves and trying to bring some kindness and gentleness to ourselves through the process. That's really what I wanted to say on that. And that's about as much of the hindrance talk, I guess, as I have time for today. So I want to thank you for your kind attention. I hope this has been useful, and we remember this is like part one of 3 or 4 parts here. We'll continue on tomorrow. So let us just sit quietly for half a minute or a minute, and then I'll ring a bell to end.